Blitzkrieg in the West, the Invasion of France, WW2. Its dawn on May 13, 1940. A sleepy town named Sedan is about to become the epicenter of military madness. The sky over the Meuse turns pitch black, not from clouds, but the mechanical roar of Stukas diving like steel hawks, dropping death and dread across French lines. Below, German infantry paddle rubber boats across the river, like a twisted Boy Scout outing. But there's no campfire waiting on the other side, only the collapse of a nation's pride. So how did the French High Command miss the signs? Why did the Netherlands crumble so fast it felt like history was being speedrun? What exactly were Guderian and von Kleist cooking up behind the Ardennes forest? Germany's seemingly innocent thicket that hid 100,000 tons of armored thunder? The answer lies in a cocktail of misplaced confidence, overstretched defenses, and a German strategy so audacious it felt like a military magic trick performed at 70 km/h. Meanwhile, in Rotterdam, flames lit up the skyline as an ultimatum turned into an inferno. And the French 7th Army, sent to save the day, only to arrive at a party that had already been looted. This wasn't just war. This was a masterclass in momentum, a sprint that crushed centuries of assumptions and sent Europe spinning toward the unknown. So ask yourself, when the sky falls and the rivers bleed history, can strategy hold back steel? Let's find out. That morning, Winston Churchill, newly installed as Prime Minister barely 6 days into the job, was jolted awake by a phone call. Not tea, not briefing papers, a voice trembling with despair. Paul Reynaud, Prime Minister of France, spoke in strained English. "We have been defeated." Churchill reeled, demanding clarification. Reynaud repeated, "We are beaten, we have lost the battle." How could it be? The war was just heating up, the armies just deployed. But Reynaud's voice cut through disbelief. What had broken was not just a battlefront, but the very heart of France's defenses. The Sedan line, thought impenetrable, had cracked like glass. Back in London, the political temperature was boiling. The Norway debate erupted in Parliament. The public and politicians alike were furious. How had Britain, with its mighty navy and global reach, failed so spectacularly? The blame fell squarely on Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, whose cautious leadership and faltering war strategy were now seen as liabilities. On May 10, 1940, Chamberlain resigned. His replacement was a man who had warned for years of the Nazi threat, Winston Churchill. The timing was no accident. That very morning, as Churchill took office, Germany launched its most audacious move yet. The world woke to thunder, not from the skies, but from tanks, bombers, and boots pounding across borders. Germany's invasion of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands had begun. In the spring of 1940, while Allied commanders braced for a repeat of World War I's trench warfare across Belgium, the Germans were quietly threading a needle through the Ardennes forest, a region the French considered too dense, too rugged, and too narrow for tanks. That assumption would prove fatal. The German High Command had entrusted General Ewald von Kleist with the most daring maneuver of the campaign, a lightning thrust through the Ardennes. His force was a steel serpent, 134,000 troops, 1,600 vehicles, including 200 tanks. Divided into 3 prongs, Heinz Guderian's corps aimed for Sedan. Georg Hans Reinhardt's corps targeted Monthermé. Hermann Hoth's corps moved toward Dinant. By 1400 on May 12th, Guderian's tanks reached the Meuse River, and astonishingly, they hadn't encountered a single enemy soldier. The French had seen movement in the Ardennes, but dismissed it as a feint. They believed the Meuse was too mighty to cross without preparation. They were wrong. French Commander General Alphonse Georges received reconnaissance reports warning of German buildup in the Ardennes. He ordered bomber support redirected from Belgium to the Meuse. But General Gaston Bilot, commanding the First Army, was stunned and watered down the order. General Charles Hunziker, in charge of the Second Army at Sedan, refused the extra air support outright. Georges sent 6 reserve divisions, but mistakenly positioned them to defend the Maginot Line's rear, not the Meuse. Meanwhile, British bombers were being shredded over Belgium. Of 135 aircraft, only 72 remained by May 12th. One of Maurice Gamelin's aides warned that the Germans were deliberately avoiding bombing Allied columns in Belgium, perhaps to lure them into a trap. He was ignored. The morning of May 13th dawned with a deceptive calm over the sleepy town of Sedan, nestled along the Meuse River. The French High Command had long considered the Ardennes forest, thick, hilly, and winding, as a natural fortress. Tanks? Through that? Impossible, they thought. But the Germans didn't ask permission. German Army Group A, led by General Heinz Guderian, had spent days threading through the Ardennes like a serpent. Their destination, the Meuse River. Their goal, a lightning breach that would bypass the Maginot Line and split the Allied front in two. The French defenders at Sedan were mostly B-series reservists, older, undertrained, and woefully under-equipped. They had just one anti-aircraft battery in the entire sector. Their bunkers were solid, but morale was brittle. At 7 a.m., the Luftwaffe unleashed hell. Nearly 1,000 aircraft, including waves of Stuka dive bombers, pounded the French positions for 8 straight hours. The psychological impact was devastating. The bombs didn't always destroy bunkers, but they shattered nerves. French soldiers abandoned their posts, fled their guns, or huddled in trenches. The defenders were blinded, deafened, and paralyzed. At 3 p.m., the Germans began their assault. Infantry units, engineers, and motorcyclists waded through swampy meadows to reach the riverbank. Under machine gun fire, they launched inflatable boats into the Meuse. One squad, led by Staff Sergeant Rubarth, crossed under fire, assaulted bunkers with explosives and grenades, and captured 7 positions in a single push. His men slogged through waist-deep water and swamp, fighting bunker to bunker. Rubarth would later receive the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for his actions. The French had no backup. Their artillery was ineffective, their communications scrambled, and their commanders stunned. The Germans seized the Marfay Heights, giving them a commanding view of the battlefield. By nightfall, Guderian's forces had carved out a bridgehead 6 miles deep, and the panzers began rolling across hastily built pontoon bridges. The French lines weren't just broken, they were dissolved. The Germans had pulled off the impossible. They crossed a river the French thought impassable. They bypassed the Maginot Line. They shattered the myth of Allied superiority. Meanwhile, in the north, German airborne troops descended like steel rain. Their target, the Moerdijk Causeway, a vital bridge linking southern Holland to the north. By swiftly capturing it, the Germans split the country in half, isolating Dutch forces in the north from potential French reinforcements. The Dutch army, stunned by the speed and precision of the assault, retreated northward toward Rotterdam and Amsterdam, hoping to regroup. But the Germans were already tightening the noose. General Henri Giraud, commanding the French 7th Army, had advanced into the Netherlands to link up with Dutch forces near Breda. But with the Moerdijk bridges in German hands and the Dutch withdrawing, his mission became impossible. Giraud was ordered to fall back toward Antwerp, abandoning the Dutch to their fate. It was a bitter pill. His forces had barely engaged, and already the plan was unraveling. The Netherlands had defied expectations. At the Afsluitdijk, Dutch forces under Captain Christian Boers held firm against the German onslaught. Fort Kornwerderzaan, bristling with machine guns and reinforced concrete, repelled wave after wave of Luftwaffe bombers and shock troops. It was one of the few places in Europe where the Blitzkrieg faltered. But the victory was fleeting. German advance units of the 39th Army Corps reached Rotterdam. They were under General Rudolf Schmidt, a seasoned commander, pragmatic and methodical. Schmidt had orders to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties. But time was against him. Every hour Rotterdam resisted, the German timetable for pushing into France slipped. The plan was brutal, but calculated. A tank assault at 15:30 on May 14th, preceded by an air raid at 15 Praus to soften resistance. At noon, Schmidt issued an ultimatum to Colonel P.W. Charroux, the Dutch commander in Rotterdam: surrender or face destruction. Charroux, stunned, said he had to consult The Hague. The Hague sent a delegation to negotiate. They arrived at 14 Sau. Schmidt, hoping to avoid bloodshed, sent a signal at 13:30 to abort the air raid. But it was 5 minutes too late. The 100 Heinkel He-111 bombers were already in Dutch airspace. Their radio operators had switched to combat mode, closing off communications. German ground troops fired red flares to signal the abort. But in the haze and smoke, they went unseen. At 15:00, 57 bombers dropped 100 tons of explosives on Rotterdam's city center. The destruction was catastrophic. Fires raged. Thousands of civilians were killed or wounded. The heart of the city was obliterated. The blast zone was apocalyptic. Over 25,000 buildings destroyed. 85,000 civilians left homeless. Nearly 1,150 people killed. The medieval heart of Rotterdam was erased in 15 minutes. Flames leapt from building to building, merging into a firestorm that turned night into a blood-red dawn. The bombing broke the Dutch spirit. That evening, the Netherlands capitulated. The government fled to London, forming a government in exile that would continue the fight from afar. The Allies responded with fury. In the days that followed, British bombers struck deep into Germany. Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne, Essen, Duisburg, Düsseldorf, Hanover, and Gelsenkirchen were all targeted. These weren't leaflet drops, they were fire and steel, aimed at crippling German industry and morale. It marked the beginning of strategic bombing as a weapon of war. Meanwhile, General Giraud's French units, retreating from Breda, were in disarray. Some were surrounded, others shattered by German armor. The remnants regrouped on Walcheren Island, where the French Navy launched a desperate evacuation. By midnight on May 17th, French resistance in the Netherlands was extinguished. Zeeland held out until the 18th, but the battle was lost. The German war machine had already stunned the world with its lightning-fast conquest of the Netherlands. Now it turned its gaze to Belgium. The first domino to fall was Fort Eben-Emael, a fortress so formidable it was considered impenetrable. But in the early hours of May 10th, German Fallschirmjäger, elite paratroopers, landed silently atop the fort in gliders, using shaped charges and flamethrowers to disable its defenses. By noon on May 11th, the fort surrendered, and the Albert Canal line was breached. The fall of Eben-Emael sent shockwaves through the Belgian command. Their defensive line along the Albert Canal was compromised, and they began pulling back to the Dial River, hoping to regroup. But this retreat threw a wrench into the French Dial Plan, which depended on Belgian forces, holding the line long enough for the French First Army to dig in. Enter General René Priou, commander of the French Cavalry Corps. He arrived on May 11th to find the Belgians had done little to fortify the Dial line. Alarmed, he requested permission to fall back to the Schelde River, a more defensible position. His request was denied. His new mission: hold the Germans at bay until the rest of the French First Army arrived on May 14th. Priou didn't flinch. He deployed his 1st and 2nd Light Mechanized Divisions to the town of Hanout, where they faced off against the German 3rd and 4th Panzer Divisions from May 12th to 144. This was no skirmish. It was the largest tank battle in history at that time, with over 1,200 tanks engaged. French tanks like the Somoua S-35 and Hotchkiss H-35 were heavily armored and well armed. German Panzer IIIs and IVs were faster and more agile, but less protected. Despite being outnumbered, the French held their ground. French losses, 105 tanks. German losses, 165 tanks. The myth that the French couldn't stand up to German armor was shattered. Priou's cavalry had bought precious time. By May 15th, the full French First Army had arrived and dug in along the Dial River, forming a solid defensive line. They repelled German attacks and held firm, but the Germans had already executed their real plan: a massive breakthrough further south through the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse River at Sedan. This meant the French forces in Belgium were now in danger of being encircled. On May 16th, the First Army was ordered to withdraw toward the French border, abandoning their hard-won positions. While the French fought at Hanout and the Dial, German forces surged forward. May 13th, Liège fell. May 17th, Germans entered Brussels and Antwerp. The British Expeditionary Force and remaining French units fell back to the River Dundre, trying to regroup. The Belgian government, now under existential threat, fled to Ostend. The Maginot Line was never meant to be a wall of invincibility. It was a delay mechanism, a fortress network designed to buy time, to hold off a German assault long enough for France to fully mobilize its forces. It was a marvel of engineering, underground railways, air-conditioned barracks, retractable turrets. But it was only as strong as the infantry supporting it. And in May 1940, that support was unraveling. On May 13th, the Luftwaffe descended like a storm over the Meuse. The French B-class reserve troops, poorly trained and psychologically unprepared, were driven off by relentless Stuka dive bombers. But contrary to popular belief, this didn't immediately result in a breakthrough. The Germans destroyed a few bunkers. By 11 p.m., they had built a bridge strong enough to carry tanks. Yet the French artillery and fortifications held firm. The 2nd Panzer Division was so bogged down, it had to be rescued by the 1st. The Maginot Line's philosophy, delay, not deny, was working, but only briefly. By May 14th, the Germans had made crossings at Sedan, Guderian's thrust. Who? Rommel's daring maneuver. Monthermé, Reinhardt's push. Rommel's crossing at Hoo was the first and most successful, thanks to his aggressive tactics. The fact that General André Corrap's 9th Army wasn't even in position. 2 divisions had marched 85 kilometers over 3 nights, exhausted and unmotorized. At Monthermé, French regulars fought fiercely. The Germans couldn't yet bring tanks across. The bridgeheads weren't fatal. A counterattack could have crushed them. But it never came. By 7 p.m. on May 13th, French infantry and armor were in place for a counterattack. But no order was given. Command hesitated, fearing premature engagement. By morning, German tanks were already rolling across the Meuse. When the counterattack finally came, it was slaughtered by panzers. On May 13th, British Air Chief Marshal Arthur Barrett gave his men a rest day after operations in Belgium and Holland. On May 14th, Allied planes attacked in small fragmented groups of 10-20. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Allied bombers suffered heavy losses and failed to destroy the German bridgeheads. Conventional wisdom said the Germans would take the ridge south of Sedan, opening the way to central France. But Heinz Guderian had other plans. He pivoted west with the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions, following the Meuse. The 10th Panzer Division stayed behind to consolidate. On May 14th, the advance was just 6 kilometers, a crawl compared to the usual 60 kilometers day pace. The French defenses, even without infantry, were doing their job. But then came the fatal decision. General Charles Hunsiger, fearing encirclement, ordered his men to evacuate that night. Heavy guns and ammunition were abandoned. What couldn't be carried in silence was left behind. The French line was dissolving, not from lack of courage, but from command failure. With Rommel pressing from the north and Guderian from the south, General André Corrap's 9th Army began to disintegrate. He was granted permission to pull back to a line from Charleroi to Rethel, a line with no natural defenses. Corrap was relieved of command. His replacement, General Henri Giraud. But what would Giraud command? The French armored reserves were scattered, exhausted, and already being outflanked. The German breakthrough at Sedan was not just a tactical victory, it was a psychological earthquake. By May 15th, the dam had burst. The French fortifications along the Meuse were now vacant, abandoned by Hunsiger's retreat order. And into this void surged the German armored spearheads. General Otto von Knobelsdorff, commanding under Reinhardt, found nothing in his path. By late afternoon, his forces had covered 60 kilometers, a stunning pace that left French commanders stunned and scrambling. The French had expected a slow grind. Instead, they faced a blitzkrieg, fast, focused, and ferocious. The French armored reserves, including the 3rd Armored Division under General Brocard, were mobile and capable. They had been sent to the left flank of the 2nd Army, where they could have struck Guderian's bridgehead on the 14th. But they didn't. The units were hastily assembled and needed refueling. General Flavigny hesitated. By the time they engaged on the 15th, Guderian was already pushing northwest, making their battle irrelevant. The French tanks performed well. Unfortunately, this battle had become irrelevant. A damning summary of tactical delay. This moment perfectly captured the difference in doctrine, German boldness and initiative versus French caution and rigidity. The fortifications, the men, the tanks, they weren't the problem. The command structure was. Orders were delayed, opportunities were missed. Counterattacks were either too late or never ordered. By May 16th, Hoth's 15th Panzer Corps, led by Rommel's 7th Division, was east of Cambrai. Guderian was approaching St. Quentin. But then came the halt order. General Kleist, more conservative, feared the panzers had overextended. He worried about exposed flanks, yet ironically, it was the speed itself that protected the Germans. The French were too disorganized to mount a flank attack. Guderian, ever the opportunist, found a loophole. He was allowed to conduct reconnaissance in force. So he kept moving. Enter Charles de Gaulle, commanding the 4th Armored Division. From near Laon, he launched a northward attack to blunt the German advance. But the Luftwaffe was waiting. Allied air support was fragmented. De Gaulle's forces were shut down, unable to make serious gains. In Belgium, Lord Gort, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, was alarmed. The German advance threatened his right flank. He appointed General Mason McFarlane, his chief of intelligence, to lead a defensive force. Gort can be criticized for weakening this important department at such a vital stage. David Somerville, WW2 day by day. By the end of the week, Cambrai and St. Quentin were in German hands. The German flanks were dangerously exposed. Even Churchill remarked, "In Paris, panic simmered beneath the surface." Government workers began burning secret files. Paul Reynaud reshuffled the cabinet, becoming Minister of Defense. Philippe Pétain was appointed Deputy PM. Maxime Weygand was recalled to replace Gamelin as Army Commander. On May 13th, Winston Churchill delivered his legendary blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech to the House of Commons. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory, however long and hard the road may be." It was a call to arms, a promise of resolve. The Dutch had surrendered, the Belgians were faltering, the Germans were racing westward, poised to cut off the British, French, and Belgian forces in the north. The heroes of this masterstroke? Von Manstein, architect of the Ardennes Plan. Guderian for his daring, Rommel for his brilliance. The villains? Gamelin for his inertia. Georges for his indecision. But most of all, Charles Hunziker, laid on fortifications, refused air support, lied about bridge conditions, pulled back troops who were holding the line. Was it incompetence, indifference, or something darker? The week ended with the Allies stunned, the Germans surging, and the world watching in disbelief.